it is one of my favourite games of the year. And I did honestly enjoy it more than The Last of Us, or any other game for that matter, this year. So for me, so far, I think Ghost of Tsushima has been my game of the year. Sam's Cup of Tea. Sam's Cup of Tea. Ghost of Tsushima was released back in July, which means it's been almost 6 months since its release. And even back then there was a lot of talk about whether this would make it as Game of the Year. We had Last of Us Part 2 a month before that, and we had games like Doom Eternal that was back in March or April. And all of those games have made it onto the official list for the Video Game Awards for Game of the Year, which is coming up like literally next week. Now, personally, I'm not really that interested in labelling Game of the Year. I just think there's really great games every year, and it's hard to pit them against each other and choose one. I mean, just look at the official lineup for the Video Game Awards for Game of the Year. It's like, you know, you've got Animal Crossing, and then you've got The Last of Us, and then you've got Doom Eternal. You've got really disparate games, and we don't even have Cyberpunk that's still yet to be released in December on that list. So the idea of picking one game to be Game of the Year and making it into this big thing seems arbitrary. And I think that just if a game makes it onto the nominee list, which Ghost of Tsushima has, I think that is the achievement in and of itself, and it's worth a purchase just from that alone, you know. But enough talk about Game of the Year. I want to talk about Ghost of Tsushima and get into my kind of review of it. I've had a lot of time to simmer on the game because I literally started playing it on the release date in July, but it took me longer than most to complete it. I really took my time and left it for a few days or a week or two and then went back to it. I wanted to really soak in the game at my own pace. I didn't want to rush through it. Also, it is a really, really big game, and there's a lot of side quests and side activities to do, and I got kind of sidetracked doing those for a lot of the time, and I'm going to talk about that. So let's get into it. Now, Ghost of Tsushima is developed by Sucker Punch Studios, which are most well known for their Infamous series, which started out on PlayStation 3. And it's basically like an amazing, unique superhero movie. Not based on a Marvel comic or anything established, completely unique. And it had all sorts of really interesting design choices and gameplay functionality. You could roam the city, you had powers, your powers changed depending on whether you were good or bad. You had actual morally weighted decisions to make in the game, and it was just a lot of fun. It was really well made. I actually got to play and complete the first Infamous and really, really enjoyed it, but I didn't get to play the second one, and then I came to the third one on PlayStation 4. And I really wasn't impressed with the third one. I found it to be quite bland and boring. It looked great, but I just found it quite empty. Having played the original, it just seemed like a sort of tech demo for the PlayStation 4. It didn't feel like it had soul to me. Maybe some people will disagree, and maybe I was wrong, but that's how I felt about it. And that was back in 2013, 2014, and since then Sucker Punch disappeared away to work on their, you know, big, huge next title, Ghost of Tsushima. And there was actually a lot of hype for this game. I remember back in like E3 in like I don't know if it was 16 or 17, there was a really like great gameplay footage intro. But like a lot of gameplay that you see on E3, you're never quite sure if you should trust it. But what was clear was that there was a beautiful art style it had. And there'd been rumours for a long time that it was cancelled after that, because we just didn't hear anything after this amazing first presentation. And what also added to the confusion was that at the same time, From Software were also developing, and then soon released last year, Sekiro. And that was also a samurai-themed game. And I kind of got the two confused in my head, like, wait, Sekiro is which one? And Sekiro ended up being an amazing game, and I absolutely loved it. And I actually cleared it. I actually completed it. It only took me 8 months.
Oh my God!
But that's a different story. So yeah, Ghost of Tsushima had this amazing sort of presentation, beautiful art style. You followed this samurai who could, you know, climb things and it just had this amazing, authentic looking samurai aesthetic. And everyone was really excited about it. But over time, I've got to admit, my excitement for the game dwindled because I've seen a lot of those titles, especially sort of Assassin's Creed type titles that are set in the free roaming arena, end up being quite underwhelming. And the presentations are always impressive, but usually it ends up being a little bit of a letdown. To put it a different way, it just got overhyped, and some of these games become victims of their own hype. And I really did worry about Ghost of Tsushima in that way. So during this year, I played many games. I've played Doom Eternal and Final Fantasy VII, but the big one I was most excited about was actually Last of Us Part 2. And I played a lot of that. If you want to check my review out, I did like a 40-minute video about it. And my opinion on that game is mixed. And it was a little bit of a letdown. And so just after that, the month following, Ghost of Tsushima was coming out. And I honestly hadn't conjured up much excitement for it. And especially since the game that I really thought was going to be amazing, sort of wasn't. And so I thought, well, this is definitely not going to be that great. But hey, maybe it'll be a surprise. But I got it on release day. And the rest is history, because this game is really, really good. And it really surprised me. Sucker Punch have knocked it out of the park. So let's get into the depth of the story. So the game is based in historical Japan during the first Mongol invasion. And the samurai are defeated at the beginning. And you play as Jin Sakai, who's part of the Sakai clan. And you've got an uncle who's Lord Shimura. And you basically witness defeat in battle. And they completely overrun the island. And you kind of survive, but only just. And then slowly but surely you begin to fight back, but in a really ragtag way. You can't really afford to fight in the traditional samurai way. And over the course of the game, you slowly develop these skills which push you more in the direction of being the ghost, which are against the very strict and moralistic principles of the samurai. And the game does a great job in establishing a mood and a setting. What I really liked was there's an emotional overtone of desperation and sadness, but also beauty and love and family and friends and connection throughout the whole game. Even in the side quests, there's a lot of atmosphere in this game. And sometimes in free roaming games, side quests tend to be very sort of anodyne and very cold feeling, but this game doesn't. That kind of emotional, can't explain it. It's a very emotional game to play. Even side quests will have you really feeling like, whoa, Jesus, it's really heavy. It's a really heavy game, but very, very enjoyable. And I was instantly invested in the story. And so for the first sort of, I'd say half of the game, you're sort of basically still a samurai and you're learning the ways. So you're fighting as a samurai. You don't have many stealth abilities, and so you basically can go up to enemies and just stand off, and you stand there and you draw your sword and you fight them head on. But over the course of the game, things start to get more tricky. You start to come across bigger camps and stronger enemies, and you have to adapt. And there are all kinds of amazing ways in which they develop this. So firstly, they start to add these 4 different stances that you unlock over time, like moon stance, and they all are applicable to depending on which kind of enemy you're fighting. So for example, a shield enemy, you have to have a certain stance. For an enemy with a spear, you have to have a different type of stance. For a heavy enemy, there's a specific stance. And then just for a general soldier, there's a specific type of stance. And so you can switch between these, and the attacks are completely different. And so you've got to kind of learn how to, on the fly, while surrounded by a bunch of different enemies, switch between these stances. So it makes combat really dynamic, and it alters it from a game that could be just, mashing square and waiting to counter. It's not quite as simple as that. And when I'd seen gameplay initially, I worried that it would be sort of Assassin's Creed-esque and just get really dull. But the combat in this game is very, very strong. So at the beginning, you don't have a lot of tools at your disposal, but as time goes on, you start to develop it. You start to develop your bow abilities, your stealth abilities. And what's interesting is that the character goes through this evolution of, being a samurai and becoming a ghost. And for a long time, I resisted that because personally, at the beginning, I just wanted to sword fight guys. That was way more fun. And it is way more fun. when you do try stealth at the beginning, it's not that satisfying. Even using a bow and certain things, it's not always as satisfying as actually just going in there with your sword. But what I found was over time, as you start to level up, there's a sort of point in the game when Jin makes a transition. And when he makes that transition, it's almost like something clicks in you as well. And by that point, you have a lot of cool abilities. And so you start to learn how to sort of thin the crowd out in, so say, an outpost or something like that, using a bit of stealth and then a bit of, you know, the sort of samurai technique. So you become this kind of hybrid of samurai and ghost, and it's very satisfying. But what's really interesting is throughout, Jin has this kind of internal conflict because his uncle, who has basically adopted him to become his son, wants him to stay away from that ghost style that's actually led them to a lot of victories. He wants him to turn back to the samurai way. And so there's this tension. There is this real tension. So there's an enemy, there's an external enemy, the Mongols, but then there's also this battle within, and it turns Jin sort of against himself and against people that he's actually allied with. And it's very, very interesting how that works. And things shift around, sort of alliances shift around during the Mongol invasion. So you meet a lot of different factions and the different ways in which they're dealing with the Mongol invasion. Some of them are not necessarily just fighting back. They're actually ended up, you know, working for them and become sort of traitors to you. And so it's really interesting how that affects relationships. And so the way that that's handled is you have the main story, and the main story is just amazing. The missions have so much impact and weight to them, and they're so exciting. And then next to that, you have the sort of side character missions, which are there's certain characters, maybe like 7 or 8 characters, maybe less, but they're basically these tales. So a certain character that you meet will have a tale arc, and you can do a certain number of them, and then you have to stop, because then you've got to advance the story further to then pick up the story again. And those are also great. They're also brilliant. And you actually get invested in their little stories that do have stuff to do with the main story, but also just have stuff to do with them, right? In their own story arc that you get kind of involved in. And I found myself getting really, really deeply involved in these different characters' arcs and stuff. And each one represents a different style of fighting. There's a bow guy who's a real master at the bow. And when you do missions for the bow guy, for example, you unlock an outfit that buffs your abilities with the bow and stuff like that. It's really cool. So there's actual gamey incentives to do it, but even without that, it's just interesting. These narratives are really interesting to explore. And what I found really, really fascinating about the game design was how they weaved that in to a game that is free roaming. Because I've always had this thing about free roaming games where in a linear game, you can do anything, right? If you're going from A to B and there's no freedom involved, you can kill a character at any point or do whatever, because the game developers themselves are calling the shots. They're basically saying this and this and this. But in a free roaming game, there has to be certain consistencies, right? You know, if a side character that you do missions for is in a later bit of the story, how can they be there? And then what if you choose to do this mission then? And you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of weird inconsistencies. And also the problem is with a free roaming game, or where you can pick and choose to do missions when you want, there can be the risk of losing the stakes, right? Because you can do the mission and think, well, I know this guy's going to, you can do the mission and think, well, I know this person's going to be alive because, you know, I'm doing the story and they're in that story or whatever. But surprisingly, they get around this in really clever ways. And I'm not going to spoil anything, but there are really, really cool ways in which they have characters sort of on the brink of something, even though you're like, wait, I could have just ignored this and done this later, but this feels so urgent. And kudos to Sucker Punch for doing that. They don't sacrifice the story, the weight of the story and its integrity for the free roaming aspects. But at the same time, the free roaming aspects are surprisingly liberal throughout the whole game. There's only one part of the game where they sort of cordon you off to one area only, and you have to do a certain amount of missions to unlock the rest of the game again. But that's much later. And I'm glad that they did that, because it really added to this sense of finality and desperation. So in and among, you've got the story missions, you've got the tales with the different characters, and then of course you've got the usual sort of free roaming activities, which range from all sorts of things. You can do haiku, which is incredible, where you sort of sit on a mat and you can make your own haiku song with a flute and you can choose the words, and that's really satisfying. And then there's fox dens where you follow a fox and then you get an unlock or whatever, and then there's also samurai swords that are sort of placed around the world that you climb up to, and these are all great. And then of course outposts. One thing I will say, and this is probably personal preference, but I tend to get a little bit bored doing menial tasks over and over again in a free roaming game. I need sort of narrative incentive, otherwise things become a little bit dull to me. And I found that in Ghost of Tsushima there is a lot of repetition in terms of the things when they first do them are really great. So for example, the fox den, the first time you follow the fox to find a secret place is great, but the 80th time is just, I mean, it's probably not 80, but it felt like 80. It really did feel like 80 times. And so sometimes you're not quite sure, you know, how much should I improve my stuff or get the all of the costumes. There's a sort of conflict within where you want to sort of do the narrative and have that involvement, but you also want all of the collectibles. And what I found was that when I'd start to get a little bit bored and feel like my brain was switching off, I'd go back to the story and do a couple of missions there. So the best thing to do is sort of do a couple of missions and then go back and do some grindy sort of quests and do all activities. And then if you start to feel tired, just go back to the main missions, because the main missions really do sort of lift you back up again and reinvest you in the story, because it can get a little bit repetitious. But that's just, you know, it's a hard criticism to really level at Sucker Punch, because if I'd wanted to, I could have just mainlined the story, and throughout, you know, every moment of my gameplay time would have felt meaningful. So that's on me, really, as the player, more than it's on them. The graphics in this game are beautiful. They are beautiful. They might not be technically the most sharp graphics ever, the most detailed, but it's the art design, it's the use of colour. And it's not, you know, what you have, it's how you use it, right? And that's exactly Sucker Punch to a T. The world is gorgeous to ride around in. It isn't bland. It really does take your breath away. Riding around on your horse, the different sort of forests and the different colours. It really reminds me of a lot of Chinese and Japanese cinema movies, especially one called Hero, which is an amazing movie with Jet Li in it. You know, in that movie they've got this sort of red leaf forests, and it's very like color coded, that movie. And Ghost of Tsushima really reminded me of that. It took me right back to there. It is gorgeous through and throughout, and I can't fault the graphics. And not only that, but the animations in the faces are brilliant, you know, throughout the cutscenes and stuff. One thing I will say is, and I saw this in another review, was there's a lack of cutscenes. That, you know, you just go up to someone and the camera pans out and you've got this wide shot, and it seems a little bit low budget, and it feels like maybe they didn't have time to do that. But it would have been nicer to have more investment in those bits, because the stuff they're actually saying and the problems they've got and the actual side quests themselves are actually pretty decent. But the kind of presentation is so very like the camera just stops there and you both stood, you know, quite far away, and there's just the dialogue happening and you can't really see their expressions or anything. And it's a far cry from the sort of the main story, which is very cinematic. That could be time constraints, budget constraints, whatever. So yeah, the graphics is incredible. The facial animations really involve you in the story. And it's a very intimate story, even though it's also epic. And it has some epic moments. There's one moment sort of a quarter of the way through the game, or maybe halfway, I'm not really sure, but your samurai leader uncle has been captured by the Mongol leader for a long time, and you finally free him. And there's just amazing bit where you're just running alongside your uncle, and he's just like going balls to the wall as a samurai, like, let's take them on head first. And you're a bit like, hang on a minute, you know what I mean? Like, I've been doing a little bit of stealth. He's like, no, fuck that, let's go 100%.
Kill them all! Back down! Fight!
And it's actually really fun, and there's this like crazy music, and it's just brilliant. And a lot of really touching moments as well in this game. It really surprised me, this game. On an emotional and narrative level, it really, really surprised me. So obviously, along with the narrative and the missions, you also have the sound and the music.
I'm sorry I couldn't protect you.
What is she dead?
The music in this game is just gorgeous. You know, most of the time when you're playing a game or you're watching a film, the soundtracks, the scores, they don't stand out. They just sort of fade into the background. But in this game, multiple times I noticed, you know, oh, wow, what is this? And it really, really gets you going in moments of epicness, in moments of sadness. It's a very melancholy score. It's a very authentic score, you know, for what it's trying to do. And I think that's the beautiful thing about this game, is that it does a lot to be authentic and take all these inspirations that they've got, you know, these Akira Kurosawa inspirations and other inspirations from Japanese cinema, and put them all in there in this one package, and take all these little things that they love, you know, the little bits of mythology that they liked and stuff like that. But this game does a great job of just staying grounded throughout the narrative, and the music just does such a service to what the story is being, you know, what story is being told in front of you. And I loved that. So again, brilliant to Sucker Punch. Now, the benefit of doing a review 6 months later is that we also had the DLC come out back in November or October. So Sucker Punch released free DLC, which was Ghost of Tsushima Legends. And now what's great about this is not only that it's free, but that it's actually brilliant. And it allowed them to tap into the more mythological sides that they couldn't explore in the game because it was based in reality. They hinted at little myths and stuff like that, but the real magic was never really there. Do you know what I mean? There, quote unquote. But in Ghost of Tsushima Legends, it's basically an online co-op sort of Destiny type thing where you've got gear and you've got different tiers of gear, you know, legendary and exotic and rare and stuff like that. And you can team up with other ghosts, assassin samurais, and do missions together. And it's actually great. It's actually brilliant. And you can upgrade your stuff, and there's just a lot of content there. And I had a lot of fun just playing with random people doing these missions. And it's not just rehashes of the game. They actually have put really interesting gameplay features in that weren't in the main game, to facilitate the sort of cooperative play, and, you know, and with in mind the idea that, you know, when you're playing cooperatively, you're going to be playing a lot faster and a lot more sort of carelessly. And so they've redesigned some of the gameplay features and added new ones in there, and really leaned in to that mythological sort of aspect of Japanese mythology or whatever. And it's really fun to see. It's really fun to see them sort of go, right, we'll forget all the realism. Let's go mental. You know, let's go absolutely mental and just have all sorts of weird creatures and cool effects and stuff like that. So, you know, having played the DLC and putting that together with the full game, it's such a great value for money. But not only that, literally, it is one of my favourite games of the year. And I did honestly enjoy it more than The Last of Us, or any other game for that matter, this year. So for me, so far, I think Ghost of Tsushima has been my game of the year. And if you haven't played this game yet, and I don't know why you wouldn't have, but if you haven't, please go out and get it. It's actually on sale at the moment on the PSN store, I think. As of now, today is like December the 6th or something, I don't know. So now on to my rating of Ghost of Tsushima. I'm going to give this game a 5 cups out of 5. This is an absolute masterpiece of gaming. It's not perfect, but no game is. But I think everything that they set out to do, they achieved. And in terms of a free roaming game, games which I usually struggle to complete half the time, this game had me interested from beginning to end. Now and then I would get lost off the beaten path, but if you stick onto the narrative itself, there's a lot of fun to be had here. And if you're the kind of person who likes to follow and chase collectibles, this game is also for you. So it has something for everyone. And coupled with the latest DLC, this game is just, it does things that other games haven't even bothered to do, which is add extra value for money and really, really do something that nobody expected them to be able to pull off. You know, better than Ubisoft could have with a samurai-themed Assassin's Creed game. I'm glad that Sucker Punch were the first to do it. But anyway, I'm excited to see what Sucker Punch do next because it's amazing. So if you haven't bought this yet, go out and buy it. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more future content on video games and movies. Sam's Cup of Tea, signing off.
Sam's Cup